Good morning. We'll be starting up here in about 4 minutes or so. For those who are registering or signing up or getting on this morning, whatever word we want to use for that, there is a handout. So you get a link to that handout. You can open up the chat pod. We will reload that into the chat pod after we get started as well. We're starting up in about 2 minutes for those who are logging in. About 1 more minute, we'll get started in. Give folks just a few seconds to sign in. Get that second cup of coffee or first, if that's what they need. While you're waiting, if you want to, you can go ahead and either open up a web page at www.polev.com/DavidOrPE, all one word, or you can even download the Polever app if you plan to come to a lot of these webinars, these fundamental why webinars. It's probably not a bad idea to have that sitting right on your phone, and you can answer the polls and the questions right on that phone as well, or your iPad if you prefer. That makes it convenient, we think. And we will be using polls for most of these webinars. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome. My name is David Orr. I'm the director here at the New York LTAP Center, New York State LTAP Center, the Cornell Local Roads program. And I want to welcome everybody to the second of our series of webinars. I'll talk a little bit more about them in a minute. One thing I forgot to check, let me just make sure I've got my pen working. And I got a color I like. I don't like that color. Red is going to be hard to see. But let's choose yellow today. No, actually, we're going to do black. We'll start with black. We can always change it. So I want to welcome everybody to the second of these webinars. Hopefully, everybody's having a good morning. It looks like the snow's cleared out, but we got some lake effect. And I want to thank those who've taken it for the team to get us started with our snow and ice. It's a little later than normal this year, but we're okay with that, I think, most of us. Now, for those who have not been on one of our webinars before, down at the bottom of your screen, you'll find your audio settings so you can change with speakers. You can open up the chat pod. We do recommend opening that chat pod. That's where we'll put links to the handouts, links to the poll everywhere, so you can just click on it. Those will show up. You can type a chat into us as the host and panelist, but generally we actually recommend that you use the Q&A. That's where we're going to look for and answer your questions. So you can open up the Q&A. And then in the middle, you'll see it says raise hands. And I may use that to ask a simple question. And just to illustrate, if you would, just show me you know how to do that by raising your hand. I'll see how many people have had that cup of coffee. Okay, perfect. Absolutely great. And then by magic, my hands are up and all the hands are going to get dropped. Because Amanda Link and Adam Howell helping in the background make this smooth as silk. And then we'll also put into the chat pod, if you open the chat pod up, you'll see the link for the Poll EV link. And the handout will be coming. I'll talk about that handout in just a second. This particular webinar is worth one professional development hour for engineering here in New York State. It's considered a course, but only the person who is registered gets credit. Unlike other things, we could have multiple people. In this one, only the person registered. If you are from outside of New York State, you'd need to check with your LTAP center to see whether or not this would be valuable. Not all of these webinars will meet that criterion, but this particular one does. So we'll get started, and welcome the snow and ice control strategy. We are using the pollev.com/DavidOrPE website or the app to answer a series of questions. And hopefully you'll find this interesting. So to get started, we're going to ask a few questions about who's on the session today, so I can see who's here, and it might change some of the things that I say, and also to make sure everything's working. So we'll start with who you work for. Do you work for a town, a county, a city or village, state or federal, private, consultant or contractor, or the weekend? So let's see what we get here. Just to give everybody a sense of how this works. So I'll give you 30 seconds or so to log all that in. And for those who can't access it, you can put your answer in the Q&A, and I'll just sort of add that to my mental brain of what the numbers are. And for those who asked, there is a certificate we will be sending out afterwards. If you're here at least 75% of the time, you'll get a certificate of completion. If you need the PDH, you need to stay for at least 90% of the time. And based upon the numbers I'm seeing, I've got a few more towns. I've got another county. I've got a couple of private people. I've got a mayor, so you'd be counted as city or village. So again, we got a blend here. That's good to know. Now it's interesting. Nobody's working for the weekend. That's good. It means all of you are professionals ready to do the job, and hopefully this works out and helps everybody a little bit. Now let's see what your job is, because this is actually maybe even more important. Okay. And that is, what is your job? Are you an administrator, mostly in the office? Are you a highway superintendent or DPW commissioner? Are you an engineer? Are you in the field crew, driving truck, things like that? Are you a board member? And just because of space, I didn't put it in. That also includes our mayors, our town supervisors. If you're an elected person, put down board member. And if you're none of the above, you can put down F. And if you do that, type into the Q&A for me, what is your title if you put in none of the above, just so I get a sense of who's on the call today. So you got a mayor, and again, I would have had you put that as a board member, but that helps me, that's fine. Okay, so about half of you are highway superintendents, some of you are engineers, we have some none of the above, and a couple of field crew folks. Okay, that helps. I'll make sure I include a little bit for all of the folks who are on the webinar today, and we'll go from there. Now, where are you from? Okay, where are you from? Okay, we got a few folks from outside, from Vermont, it looks like they've shown up. That's cool. As I've said, these webinars, we're trying to set them up for folks anywhere. They're going to be focused on New York State, especially some of the legal ones we do later on, but it's useful. As I see, I've got somebody here from Orange County, Adams, New York, Yates. Charlie, I know you're from Yates County. That's always the challenge in New York because we have counties and we have towns with the same name. Sometimes they're in the same place and sometimes they're not. My favorite of that is Rochester. Be very careful if you go to Rochester. Make sure you pick the right one, because there's one that's the city where there's a bunch of the whatever that color is, purple, and there's also a Rochester town down not too far in just at the edge of the Catskills. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about snow and ice control strategy, and with that, this is part of an overall series of webinars that we're doing. We don't have the best name yet. I'm calling them Y webinars just so we can differentiate them from some of the ones we've done in the past and others that we might do mixed in on different days of the week. But these are going to be on Tuesdays at 9 to 10 a.m. when we're not doing other events or it's not a holiday week. Like next week, we will not be having one because it's that state holiday called deer season. We don't want to interrupt that. Oh, there's this other one on Thursday, by the way. I hope you've got your turkey already. But we're going to focus on these webinars, not on the heavy nuts and bolts, though we will talk a little bit about nuts and bolts. We're going to focus on the why we do things. So as you're developing, in this case, a snow and ice control strategy, why do we do certain activities, and hopefully help you put that together. Now, for the rest of this year, we have 3 more after this one. We'll have a whole bunch over the rest of the winter and then some next summer. Just so you know, we do have one on the overall snow and ice control overview that we're going to be holding next summer to help you get ready for next year. There's a lot of these. There's 35 total webinars. Now, if you're interested, and let me go find it here. There it is. There is a handout, and you can go to the chat and get a copy of the handout. On the first page is sort of an outline of what we're talking about today, a list of some publications you may find useful, especially one we have, which is a draft snow and ice control plan that you can get right off of our website, and then some other national publications from Federal Highway Administration, State Department of Transportation, and the American Public Works Association that you may find useful as you develop your own snow and ice control strategy. And then page 2 lists all of the Y webinars that we're planning on doing both this year and even into next. Okay. So let's talk about a little bit with snow and ice control strategy and what we're going to be doing today. Now, we're going to start with the weather, because obviously the weather makes a big difference. And based upon where you're located, the nice thing is that none of you were from, the deep south, nobody from Florida today, but the weather makes a difference, and you need to know the weather in your particular area, and it makes a huge difference. The weather in Lewis County is going to be very different than it is going to be on Long Island, though there are some, of course, similarities and things we have to be aware of. We need to talk about your transportation network. And we're going to make sure we understand that transportation network is not just your roads. For a lot of you, especially those of you from cities and villages, your transportation network is a lot larger than just highways. And even in rural areas, you maintain a lot more than just pavement. Okay. Now, you've got your fleet of equipment. We're going to talk about that a little bit. We're going to talk about the chemicals and abrasives and all the things we put down to help the fleet. And then finally, we're going to put all that together and develop a snow and ice control plan, which essentially becomes the strategy as we're dealing with all of this. Okay. Now, we're going to start with a poll EV to help. Let's see where everybody stands. What kind of winter weather do you deal with? And try to do this with one word if you can. What kind of winter weather do you deal with? Okay. And this is at pollev.com/DavidOrPE. You deal with snow, obviously snow. All winter weather, yeah. Everybody's putting down snow a lot, extreme snow. Yeah, ice. Ooh, ice. That's always a fun one. Freezing rain, my least favorite. Okay. Sleet. Drifting. Ooh, that's an important one. Don't let me forget to bring drifting up when we talk about our plans later on and things you might do dealing with drifting. Yeah, actually, I do have a thing we'll talk about drifting. Wind. Refreezing again. Yep. Freezing rain. Start thinking about the snow and the ice that you have to deal with, the climate, the weather that you have to deal with on a regular basis. And I like this mixed bag. Yeah, it's a mixed bag operation that you can think about. Okay. Because when it comes to the weather and the climate in New York State, and I know some of you are from Vermont today, your weather isn't that different. But the point is, you need to know the winter weather that you're going to have to deal with. And of course, every year is different. This year, our snow and ice season is starting pretty late. Normally, we get our first significant snowfall in most of upstate, that's above the little triangle of the lower part of New York, sometime in the first week or so of November. But this year, it's coming out here in start of the third week. 2 years ago, if you remember, we got some early snows in October, pretty dry through November and December. And then setting up in January, we got a lot more snow. So every year is different. The temperatures are different. So while you would develop a plan, that's why today we're talking about strategy, because you've got to be flexible. You got to deal with the fact that every place has got differences that you got to deal with. So you need to know your weather and climate. And these are average, by the way, for those who are wondering, these are average snowfall amounts here in New York State over the last 20, 25 years, not counting the last 2 or 3. It always takes a couple of years to catch up. So for those of you who are in Lewis County and Oswego County, out along the end of Lake Erie, you get a lot more snow, over 200 inches plus, okay? And of course, cold temperatures to go with it. For those who are, by the way, in the lake effect bands off of Lake Erie, plan on Lake Erie staying thawed all year. It's much warmer this year than in the past couple of years. Because of that warmth, it's going to stay open, i.e. open to lake effect, longer, which means you're going to be dealing with lake effect snows longer. Some years Lake Erie freezes, and once that happens, the lake effect machine shuts off, which is why it's usually less than the 200 you see up on the Tug Hill. But in terms of winter weather patterns, okay, you need to learn the winter weather patterns. Why do we deal with these things? Because we need to be able to understand the weather forecast and what that probably means. So for instance, if we get an Alberta clipper coming down out of Canada, or one of these winter bomb cyclones, as you might hear, what do you think that's going to do in terms of weather you have to deal with? Okay. So in the Q&A, what do you think you're going to deal with? If you see, on the forecast, we've got a bomb cyclone or an Arctic clipper, what are you expecting to see in terms of weather you're going to have to deal with? You're going to see a quick snow. You're not going to see a heavy, wet snow. It's probably going to be a lot colder. Okay. So the quick, heavy burst, possibly lake effect, certainly, if you're in the lake effect bands, very, very common. Okay. But what are you going to deal with? So as you learn the forecast, you're going to have to deal with different events. Okay. So an Arctic blast, cold temperatures, lake effect, small quick storms, okay, you're going to have a different operation. Now, let's say you get one of these storms that comes out of the Gulf of Mexico, when my pen decides to, and it goes up the Atlantic, and it decides it wants to come visit New York City. Okay, you all know what this is called. It's called the nor'easter. Okay, what happens when you get a nor'easter coming in terms of the weather that you have to deal with? A lot of wind. Okay, that wind is going to be coming not out of the west, but it's coming out of the east. That's where the eastern comes out of the nor'easter. Okay, and it circles back on itself. So you get winds out of the north and the east, which just crazy. but you get heavy snow. Yeah, across the whole state, across Vermont, for those from Vermont, because now we're bringing up all that moisture from the Gulf and from the Atlantic. Okay. And the winds aren't out of the same direction. So your drifting patterns might be different. They don't occur that often, but when they occur, that's where some of our biggest storms come from. And of course, the more common storms that we get, they just generally come across the country. And there you're going to have to watch what kind of storm is it? Is it one with a lot of moisture? Does it get some moisture because there's a secondary low? So you got to learn to be a little bit of a weather forecaster to watch for these kind of activities. And you need to know the weather pattern for your particular area. Almost anybody who has done this for very long starts to learn what the weather's saying, what the roads are saying, and what route they need to drive to figure out, oh, I'm going to have a snow issue today, or it won't be too bad. Okay. So as you're developing your plan, your strategy, think about the winter weather patterns that you want to deal with and what you're going to have to deal with in terms of winter weather. Now, we got a little bit sense of the weather. Let's talk about your transportation network. And again, as I mentioned, the transportation network is not just your roads. So again, with one word, what do you maintain in the winter? Okay. I see some people have already caught on and are quickly adding in. So you're obviously going to be maintaining roads. And if you're with the county, you're maintaining the county roads. If you're with a town, you might be maintaining some county roads as well if you have a contract. You may have driveways. You may have parking lots. You may have sidewalks. Okay. Obviously, you might have a campus. Campus could be a university, a school. You could be maintaining school grounds. Hopefully, you're doing that with contracts and properly budgeted. But what do you be maintaining? You've got parking lots. Okay. So your transportation network isn't just your roads. Now, for some of you, it is. You know, when I was in Yates County, we just maintained roads. We didn't do any of the parking lots. That was done by the buildings and grounds folks. Oh, except for our own parking lot. So you need to think about, oh, I like that. Somebody's got a helicopter pad they have to maintain. Okay. But again, the thing you need to start is making a list of what you have to maintain for your transportation network. And it's usually a longer list than you might think. Okay. And yeah, you may have parks, you may have sidewalks. Do those parks stay open? Do you deal with the buses? Do you have a setup? For instance, what happens when you get a big event and you got to deal with emergencies and the fire companies? And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Somebody put in dirt or gravel roads. They're going to be treated differently than if you've got paved roads or concrete sidewalks. You've got pedestrians, you've got bicyclists. Who's using your system as well is something you need to think about. So our roads are our dominant player and sidewalks right behind it in our little list here. We need to think about the differences in our system, okay? And your transportation system could be roads that are paved and unpaved. It could be sidewalks where people are walking. You could have trails in rural areas. Do you maintain them year round, or do you let them just become ice and snow covered in the winter? And if you do leave them open and people keep using them, does that reduce your liability or not if people are still using them? We could get lawyers involved in that. But the whole point is you first need to make a list of what you have to maintain. And then, of course, for that network, you need to think about the level of service that you're going to be maintaining. Obviously, we don't want to see crashes. But that's the thing is we need to have a level of service. What is an expectation of the public? And what is the expectation on your network? Okay. Now, I'm going to take a side tour here. Again, we're not normally going to get into heavy nuts and bolts in these webinars, but once in a while we sort of have to. In this case, let's talk about stopping distance. Now, this is a stopping distance ratio. The great thing about this is that the stopping distance ratio, this isn't the perception reaction part that we'll talk about with traffic safety in December. This is the, once you put your foot on the brake, how much longer does it take for you to actually stop? Okay, hopefully people driving in snow and ice are thinking a little bit tighter, but how much longer does it take to stop? So on dry pavement, whether you're bicycling or walking or even in a wheelchair versus slushy pavement, okay, you need twice as far to stop your vehicle, okay? If you've got fresh sand on packed snow, that is surprisingly actually about the same as this slush with no ice, okay? So slush with no ice, fresh sand on packed snow, like you might have on a gravel roadway, both are about twice as far a distance to stop, but imminently stoppable. It's not a major safety issue if people are behaving properly, but we all know that's not always true, okay? You start getting soft, loose snow, it gets a little bit longer, and you've all seen that if you've ever been at a ice skating rink. When you get that snow, it's not too bad if you're careful, but it can be very slippery because that thin layer of snow can almost turn into ice as you're on it. If you start getting light traffic and you've just put down sand, once that light traffic gets on top of the sand, it blows the sand off or it crushes it into the snow and it gets even slicker, okay? And of course, straight snowpack with nothing treated, no treatment at all, can actually get pretty slippery. You'll get spots of ice. So that's why the stopping ratio is up to 4 times as far. And then finally, of course, ice, 6 plus. We've all hit black ice. We've all seen pure ice. The only thing that's going to stop you there is something else, and that's not usually good. Hopefully, it's just a snowbank and you can pull out and drive away, but it could be another vehicle. It could be a sign. It could be a traffic utility pole. So ice is the one we want to avoid at all costs, but even snowpack, we want to avoid that when we can, but obviously on some things, like on a gravel road, we may have to deal with that. But now what we need to think about is setting a reasonable level of service to deal with these kind of conditions, okay? So let's talk about your pavement condition goals, okay? So obviously this would be weather like we have right now, most of us, unless we got a little snow last night. Road is completely black, completely bare, okay? The public, of course, in their mind, always wants this. They want that road to have nothing on it at all times. But that's not recommended. It's not realistic, and it's expensive for lots of things, not just cost, but environmentally as well. Really hard to have a pure black road policy or bare road policy, okay? Even this is not a bare road. This starts to be spots where you do have to start to drive a little bit more care so that you don't hit these spots of ice. But this is a level of service you might reasonably expect on your main roads, where there's a little bit of pockets here and there. We get rid of most of them, but people can still travel at reasonable, normal speeds, just being a little bit more careful, okay? Now, how quickly do you get to this during or after a storm? That's part of that setting of level of service. Now we're dealing with, we've got that slushy snow condition, okay, and pockets of ice. Now we do actually have some ice to deal with. Our distances to stop have gone up. This is sort of right after a storm event would probably be okay, but you certainly don't want to leave this very long in your collectors, your main roads, things like that. But in a residential area, this might actually be okay, depending on what weather is coming up next. So you may actually have to adjust your level of service depending on the weather as well and the traffic volumes. This is a condition which happens. There's nothing we can do about it, okay? In this particular case, you're starting to see ice, okay? And the challenge with this, of course, if you've got ice, is now you've got a safety issue depending on the traffic. Now, this is a residential area. It's actually right next to where the guy who wrote our snow and ice workbooks, Dewey Angela, lived. It's probably okay for a short period of time, but long term, this could actually be a safety issue. So now, before I show my last one, I have a couple of things in the Q&A, and it says, does the interstate and major parkways have bare road policies? I.e., does the State Department of Transportation have a bare road policy? Not in writing, but there's been a push, look, got to keep the roads black. There's concerns about liability, and that's that balancing act. On one side of the coin, everybody wants the road to be bare, and we're worried about the liability. But to get to that, you have to put a lot of effort in, a lot more fleet, a lot more snow and ice control chemicals, and now there's an environmental cost. And you have to balance those two, okay? So if you want to set a policy, we don't recommend a bare road policy. We recommend a safe road policy. Try to keep the roads as safe as possible, but you can't handle every single storm. And just think about it for a minute. Imagine we get one of those Arctic clippers coming down and we get a lake effect ban. Okay, I noticed several of you were from lake effect country. What would be in the lake effect country in the Q&A, put in there, how much snow do you expect to get in a really good lake effect band in one night? How much snow? Somebody want to throw that in the Q&A for me. How much snow do you expect? 12 inches, up to 3 feet. Yeah, there are places where they don't talk about 1 to 2. They talk about in inches. They talk about 1 to 2 feet. And that's not considered a major event. There is no way you could have a bare road policy in a case like that. What you have to do is figure out how quickly you can get that road to whatever you want for your condition and what is the right condition. The condition I would target to eventually is getting rid of any ice, breaking any bonds, and we'll talk about that as we develop our plan. Okay. Now, obviously, during the event or just after, the road may be completely covered. So you may need to have good delineation and signage. How do you make sure you stay on the road? You know, if you're sitting in the truck and you see corn coming up over the hood, you're probably not where you need to be. In the middle of winter, you can probably get away with it. But right now, if you get off of that shoulder, you may have a stuck truck. And if the traffic follows behind you, it could be bad. But yeah, during the event, there's no way to have a bare road policy. And again, having one can actually cause its own environmental issues as well. So how quickly do you get to one after your storm? Okay. So let's just ask, does your agency have a level of service for snow and ice? Does your agency have a level of service for snow and ice? Yes, in writing. Yes, in my head or in a bunch of notes that's not been confirmed. You need to develop one. Okay. You don't have one or none of the above. And if you type in none of the above, tell me what the none of the above is. And again, I'm looking at the Q&A as well. We've got a couple of people who said they do have one in writing. That's good. I've got someone who says no, which is fine. Again, I don't have any problem with that, but you may want to think about it because there's some value in having a level of service. Okay. So you may want to think about developing one. And if you're unsure, go check and see. Now, do you want the same level of service on every single road? Well, the answer to that pretty obviously is no. But it's pretty important to have a good level of service. Okay. That's really very important to have a level of service. Because if you don't have one, then you don't really have a plan to how to deal with that storm event. One of the things I would recommend to you if you don't have a level of service policy is start looking at the functional classification of your roadway system. Okay. Now, this is from the New York State's functional classification viewer. You just search New York State DOT functional classification and this pops right up. And this gives you the federal functional classifications. We talked about this last week. So here, this is the city of Ithaca. The green lines and dots, those are the arterials, okay? The reds are minor arterials, and then the blues are the collector roads. So if you didn't have anything else you could start with, you could say, I'm going to start with the roads I want with the highest level of service that I maintain first are the arterials. Then I go down to the collectors and find the locals. But even within the local system, you have roads that are more critical, more important, okay? Because, for instance, if you'll notice, there's a series of circles, little symbols on here, schools, okay? So you might want to maintain the roads to those schools, whether they're collectors or not. They give one symbol for all of Cornell there, but the point is you may want to maintain those roads in a little different condition, or work with the school district to figure out timing on when you're going to do those activities, okay? So as you start thinking about level of service, it's pretty important. And we're going to come back to why a policy is good here in a couple of minutes. So keep that in mind as we put together. What is your level of service and why is it important to have one? Okay. Now let's put the fleet into the system. How many trucks do you have in your fleet? How many trucks do you have in your fleet? This is just trucks for now. I just want to give an example just to start with. How many trucks do you have? Okay. Okay, so I've got most of you have 5 to 10. And by the way, statewide, yeah, I would say that is probably by far the most common number. You go statewide. That's for towns, counties, villages, even cities. 5 to 10 is really common. Generally, if you've got less than 5, that's because you got a really small system. If you got more than that, you got a pretty big system. But again, by itself doesn't really mean much because it depends how many miles are you maintaining? What are you maintaining? Okay? But it's a good place to start. Start with what you know, what you can count, and then start developing your plan around that. And again, we've got a 6, a 10 to 25, a 7, and a 5 to 10. And by the way, when I ask this, I hope you realize I'm talking about the trucks available to do snow and ice control. If you got an old truck that just hauls stone, it's not going to be used at all in snow and ice. That's not part of your fleet available for doing snow and ice. But do you have a backup to your fleet system? What types of trucks do you have? That makes a difference. Now, as you're developing your strategies, think short term and long term. Your short term plan is, what have I got now? The types of trucks, 6-wheel, 10-wheel, what attachments I've got. Okay. So that's what you start with. But long term, what might you want to have in your fleet and how do you get to that as you develop your plan? Do you have plows on all of your trucks or not? Do you have applicators? And I purposely don't say spreaders because applicators could be dry chemicals, it could be wet, it could be liquids. You know, do you have spinners? Do you have all these different tools and events? We'll talk a lot more about that next summer when we talk about the overview. And if you want even more detail, we have the whole workbook on snow and ice, and we can do a full day workshop on talking about all of this equipment. Okay. A good question, by the way. What speed should you plow at? Well, again, it depends upon the conditions, but generally you're not driving that fast. Okay. In an urban area, you're probably going to be closer to 10, 15 miles an hour. You can't get going that fast. You've got to be safe and controlled. Okay. In a more rural area, you might get up 20, 30 miles an hour. You get much faster than that, though. Think about it. If you're putting down the chemicals and you're plowing, there's probably still some ice under there. How quickly can you stop? How quickly can you be safe? You need to be enough to throw that snow off to the side. And by the way, the folks who are here listening in the field crew, talk to them. They've got a pretty good sense probably of how quickly they can safely drive. And by the way, it may be different depending on the conditions of the road and the terrain. Certainly going down a hill, you actually want to control your speed versus going uphill. Okay. By the way, that's a great question in the Q&A. How many mechanics do you have? Do you have enough mechanics to keep the fleet running? And what happens if something breaks down? Do you have a spare? Okay. So we got to keep that in mind. Do you have weather feedback information? Okay. That could be a system sitting in your office, one of these old satellite systems. It could be your internet connection, getting the weather off the internet. Heck, the cell phone is one of our best tools for getting good weather information. But how do you get that out to the truck driver? Some trucks have built in weather systems to tell them what the pavement temperature is. How do you communicate back and forth? That weather feedback, that two-way radio is actually part of your weather feedback. So as you're developing your plan, think about that because that's why we have them. Okay. And again, the fleet also includes the operator. I didn't put the operator in here, but the operators is really part of the equipment that you've got to have, your fleet. You know, if you've got 6 trucks and you've got 6 operators, you get a breakdown of a truck, you're down to 5. You get a person who gets sick. And by the way, we're not talking COVID. We're talking anything from a flu to the shingles. They're out for a day or two. You're down to 5 again. You got to have an operator. You got to have the equipment. And if you've only got 2 mechanics, like somebody put in the Q&A, and you've got a major issue, how do you deal with that? Can you do something with your neighbor? We'll talk about that in just a second. Now, we need to know about your chemical and abrasive policy. You're going to be using some chemicals and or abrasives, like it or not. Okay. You're going to have some salt, probably. If nothing else, just to keep your sand from freezing. You're going to have some sand, especially if you've got gravel roads. You have to have some sand. You can't just do straight salt on a gravel road. Otherwise, you'll make a mud pit. Okay. Now, how do these chloride salts work? I can't go into deep detail in a 1-hour webinar, but I just want you to understand they work by lowering essentially the freezing point, the temperature point of the mixture. It's the same way we make ice cream, okay? As you add salt to water, the actual temperature of the mixture goes down. And what happens then, if you've got some snow or ice sitting on the ground and you put down some salt, whether it's sodium, magnesium, or calcium chloride, those are the most common. There are some others. That mixture lowers the freezing point, but it also turns it into a brine. As it turns it into a brine, it becomes semi-liquid, a little bit of ice mixed in with a little bit of salt, with a little bit of water, okay? And that mixture, that brine, can now be plowed off or taken off by traffic. Just the energy of the traffic can move it off to the side. But you put down your salt and your snow. As more snow comes down or freezing rain, it dilutes it. As it dilutes it, the percent of chloride goes down. As that percent of chloride goes down, the freezing comes back up. The temperature of the mix comes back up. So if you've got a really cold day and you've got a lot of dilution potential, a lot of moisture coming down, you're not going to get as much value out of any of your salts because you can see they track pretty closely to each other here at the top. Okay, so realize that what you're using for chemicals, it might start pretty well if you got a magnesium or calcium, but it's going to dilute really quickly. And as it dilutes, they're all going to track about the same. And they're not going to work when it gets really, really cold and there's a lot of dilution potential. So we get our Alberta Clipper, maybe the magnesium chloride and the calcium chloride help us get started. But if it's really cold, it may not be as much good as you think, but you have to balance those activities, okay? And of course, you're going to be careful about putting these chlorides down on a gravel road because they'll melt any ice you've got in the gravel, and now you turn into a mosh pit. Now, you may have heard of the term anti-icing. The concept behind anti-icing is to keep the bond from occurring on the roadway. So the idea is you actually, in some cases, purposely put down the materials before the event. Okay, that's why this truck in this case is putting down anti-icing. They're putting down a liquid. And the reason they want to use a liquid is, again, back to that, why do we do it? We put down a liquid because it stays, it sticks. Now, it actually dries up a little bit. You'll actually see that when you drive. The state does a lot of anti-icing, where they spray this liquid material and it dries up pretty much in place, which is really good because now when it does snow, traffic comes along and tries to turn it to ice, you've already got the salt there to keep a bond from occurring, and then you can come along with a plow and you can plow it right back up. But how quickly do you get to it? Because if you don't get to it quick enough, it dilutes too far on that chart, the bond starts to form with the pavement, and now the plow can't take care of it. So how quick is your cycle time? That makes a difference in what your policy is. So let's talk about your chemical and abrasives policy. Which one of these items, I've listed 6 possible things you could have in your policy, your overall plan. You have salt, and by the way, when I say salt, I mean sodium, calcium, and or magnesium chloride, okay? So do you use salts? Probably yes, probably everybody. You can check all these, by the way. Do you have some abrasives in your mix? Okay, you probably do. You probably need to have some available on a really, really cold day. Or if you get an ice storm event, you may want to put some abrasives down short term. Do you have treated salt? And these treated salts could be pre-treated in a pile, where you pre-treat them with one of these chemicals, chloride chemicals, like waste products from making of wine and cheese. Makes them sticky, so they stick in place, but you can still have them mostly a dry form, but they don't get blown off by traffic. Or it could even be pre-wetted material, or you can even wet it right as you're dropping out of the truck. Sort of cool different things you can do, okay? You could do pure liquids, you put them down. You could do this anti-icing technique as an overall with your overall plan. Any of those and all of those may be in your plan. And for those who are maintaining the arterials and collector systems, state and county, you probably want to be thinking about all of these different activities and then dealing with the realities of that. So yeah, everybody here pretty much who has voted for salt, okay? Abrasive wise, most of you have some abrasive. You're going to have some. And again, if you've got a gravel road, you're going to have some abrasives, okay? Now, how much salt do you mix in that? As little as you can. And we'll talk about why in just a minute, okay? Because it does come back to environmental issues. We know this is an issue. We have gotten in the habit of using salt in a de-icing form to take care of all of our problems. And you just throw down all the salt, let it melt everything. But the amount of salt you have to use is huge. And it has led to purchasing of wells, okay? It has led to lawsuits. It has led to damage to plants along the side of the roadway. Oversalting doesn't really make the road any safer. It doesn't improve the level of service. We want to have the right amount of chemical to do the job. And the best way to do that is to have an overall well-developed strategy in our plan, okay? And to illustrate this, let's talk about your storage, okay? Now, I didn't put in a poll question on here, but again, I'm going to ask you to go back down and raise your hand. Raise your hand. I'm going to lower all hands first. Raise your hand if you have a storage structure for your salts. Raise your hand if you have a storage structure for your salts. Okay. So about half of you raised your hand. Okay. If you're not sure, that's fine. Okay. Now I'm going to lower all the hands again. I'm going to ask you to raise your hands again if you have a storage structure for your abrasives, your sands, or cinders for those who still actually have access to cinders. So about half of you raised it for salt, only a few of you have raised it for your abrasives. But most of you have some abrasives available, again, for ice storms and if you've got gravel roads. Okay, but now let's look at two piles that are sitting out. They're not under cover. They're sitting out. One pile is pure salt pile, 50 feet in diameter. Okay, now we're going to make another pile of sand, okay, that is 50 feet in diameter, and it's got 10% salt in it, okay? Just enough salt to keep it from freezing before you put it into your truck, okay? So it's only 1 to 10. I get a 1-inch rain event comes along, okay? And I collect all the water. I actually collect all the water into a couple of buckets. How much of the salt and the sand with the salt in it gets washed into the bucket? There's a lot of water, but how much of that is salt? So out of the salt bucket, okay, 1-inch rainstorm, 50-foot diameter pile of snow. After that event is over, and let me change my pen color here. Supposedly a way I can do that quicker, but if you do 1 inch of rain on a 50-foot diameter pile, you get 100 pounds of salt that gets dissolved by the rain, washed into our bucket. And part of the reason we also don't like to have the rain on the snow is it turns into crusty material. It's hard to get into the truck itself. So guess what? I don't like that. How much salt, if I was to measure the salt, comes off of the sand pile with only 10% salt in it? How much? What do you think? Somebody in the Q&A tell me, how much salt do I actually get when it rains on my open sand pile? Nobody wants to take a risk. 10 pounds, 60 pounds, 100 pounds. It turns out, they've checked this, it saturates and it winds up about 96 pounds approximately. Now, as your concentration goes up, you get more to the point, eventually you'll get to the point where it stops at 100. It can't get more than 100, just like this pure salt pile. But the amount of salt you have run off is almost the same. And if you're mixing at a higher ratio, closer to 1 to 4 or 1 to 5, like a lot of folks do, you're going to be getting 100 pounds. So you may want to cover your salt sand pile just as much as you cover your pure salt pile, because of environmentally, and it's easier to work with. So keep that in mind. So now let's put all this together in our last 15 minutes together and develop a plan. Again, we're only going to be talking about the whys. There's a lot more details in the handout you may want to look at. So let's first start talking about your routes, okay? Because this is the driving force. And remember, those routes might be roads, but they also might be sidewalks and parks, and when are you going to do them? So let's first ask the question about the length. What is the cycle time of your routes? Okay, so in the Q&A, what's the typical cycle time for your routes? Okay, from the time the person leaves the barn, drives and does their route, gets back, and this is important, and reloads the truck to be ready to go back out again. What is that cycle time? Okay, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours? You need to include that. And by the way, you do need to include at least 15 to 30 minutes for them to take care of what they need to take care of when they're back at the barn. So that's your cycle time, which of course affects everything else. Do you need to have more chemical if you got a longer cycle time? Yeah. So these are things to think about. The time of day. Do you have 24-hour staffing? Most towns and counties do not. The state does. They shift their work, but it changes the number of trucks that are available. But what time of day are you working? And of course, this goes back to your level of service and your staffing that's available. The driving force for most of us at the local level is our schools. Okay? We get our trucks out and we set it up so people can get the buses out and get them safely to school. If you have that as your policy, it turns out most commuters will be okay. Okay? So generally schools drive everything. And if you think about it, there's a good reason why. So we start to get kids to school and then we want to make sure we get them home safely. That drives our time of day if we don't have a 24-hour cycle. Do you have curves and hills? Does that change your amount? Well, the answer, of course, is yes. You want to have a little bit more going down a hill, but you want to balance that with not too much because it doesn't really help you as much as you might think. If you've got a good plan in place with anti-icing, pre-wetting, things like that, you can actually keep the amounts down and not just go crazy going down the hill. But of course, you do have to deal with shade. Shade does make a difference. You don't get that sunlight. Sunlight does help you. You know, we do see the sun. In fact, actually, I see blue sky out my window. That's pretty cool. But shade can make a difference. But of course, shade can also help you because you get drifting if you've got open plains and flat things. So do you have drifting? Do you have snow fence? And again, snow fence could be fence you put up, or it could even be farmers where they don't take down the last couple of rows of corn. Most drifting, by the way, occurs right at the fence. You need distance from the fence to the road. Don't put your fence right up next to the road. Think about why. It's pretty important. You got to be further back, 50, 150, even 200 feet, depending on how much drifting you're getting. And again, we could get in the nuts and bolts in a more detailed session. Do you have to deal with parking? Is it a parking lot? Is it on-street parking, especially in the villages and cities? Or as you get into urban areas, you got to deal with that, okay? That changes your approach pattern. Do you stop parking parts of the day? Here in Ithaca, they turn on and off odd and on-street parking so they can plow the roadways. Do you do that? And how do you communicate that to the public? And then finally, you got to deal with all the different types of traffic, not just the cars and the trucks and the buses, but the pedestrians and the bicycles. And are those urban bicycles? Are they rural? I know some of you are in places where there are people on bicycles year round. Either they're Mennonites and Amish, or you just get people who just insist on biking in any weather. You need to account for that as you're developing your overall plan, okay? Now, in terms of your spread rates and your patterns, it's going to make a huge difference in terms of what you've got for a policy of chemicals versus abrasives. You're probably going to be mostly hopefully using chemicals. It turns out you actually put less chemicals in the system if you've got a good plan, if it's chemical first, not abrasive first. But to do that, you've got to account for that weather that we talked about. You've got to account for your cycle time. That makes a big difference in terms of how much you need to put down so it doesn't create bonds. How does the pavement make a difference? Why do I have pavement in my list of things I got to think about when I'm thinking, why do I do this? Why do I have pavement in there? Why do I have pavement in there? Smoothness can make a difference. An open surface can actually take the liquids and drop them down. They don't do quite as much good. They do more than most people think, but it can make a difference. Wheel rutting can make a difference because it can hold the water and be a safety spot to deal with. Okay, yep. It also turns out, by the way, when it comes to determining the application rate, air temperature is actually not the important factor. It's the pavement temperature. Now, yes, air temperature is going to affect pavement temperature, whether the sun is hitting it or not. But whether there's traffic can make a difference as well. It's the pavement temperature that decides whether bonds of ice are going to form. The pavement temperature is above freezing, even if the air temperature is below, it's not going to freeze. And that freezing point will change if you've got the chemicals in the right place because it lowers that freezing point by that curve that you see. So if you've got the right amount of chemical, you can get a little bit colder temperature. You don't get a bond, but it's the pavement temperature, not the air temperature. Is there a correlation between air temp and road temp? Absolutely there is, but it's a lag. The air temperature lags, or the pavement temperature lags with the air temperature, but you've also got cold coming up from underneath, especially in we get deep winter, we've got ice underneath. It keeps the pavement closer to freezing than we might expect. So there is a correlation, but once you get frost in the ground, that can actually drive a lot of the temperature of the pavement surface itself, okay? And again, these are things to think about that you got to be aware of, okay? And of course, you got to deal with traffic. Traffic can help us. We get a lot of traffic. It can heat the roadway up a little bit. But if traffic stops for even a short period of time, you lose a lot of that benefit. Here in the city of Ithaca, that's a known problem where we get a bad event, you can't get up one of the hills, traffic stops. Now all that energy from the traffic doesn't help, and we get bonds of ice starting to form. So be aware of that as you're developing your overall strategy, your overall plan. And then again, what materials are you using? Chemicals, salts, additives, pre-wetting, liquids, all these things change your spread rates and even your patterns of where you put it. One thing we do recommend, try to put the material near the center of the road if you're doing any kind of pre-wetting or anti-icing kind of activities, and try to go with things that are sticky, pre-wetted liquids. If it's just dry materials, like a dry sand, traffic is going to knock that off after about 15, 16 trips. It's not going to do you that much good. So you really want to try to wet them down. Now you got to deal with emergencies. And there are two major types of emergencies we have to deal with. The first one are crashes, small localized events. In that case, you're probably just going to have a small crew go out and take care of the small spot. Maybe even with a smaller truck, a pickup truck or a small 1-ton or a 6-wheeler versus a major storm. Now you're getting a declaration, could be an ice storm, could be a freezing rain event. The one thing I will tell you, if you want to think about it from an economic standpoint, if you get a major event, have somebody go get photographs, get records, document. Because if it's declared an emergency to get reimbursement, you need that documentation. So keep that in mind, okay? And then earlier I mentioned what happens if a truck breaks down, okay? Most of you said you had 5 to 10 trucks. Do me a favor, raise your hand if you have no spare. So raise your hand if you have no spare truck. So if you've got a truck breakdown, you've got a problem. Only a few of you, that's good. It's good to know that you have spares. If you've got a spare, that's better. But if you don't have a spare, one thing you might want to think about is shared services. Could you share with somebody else? Borrow a truck short term, usually with an operator, by the way, we recommend, but you could do it without. And the same thing could be true, by the way, for a mechanic. Or if you run out of salt, maybe you go talk to the county or the state. In this case, you see a county and a state working together. The county is loading the state trucks. They share, and then you got to figure out who's paying for what and things like that. Okay? So keep these all in mind as we develop our overall plan, our overall strategy. Now, I said I'd come back to this. Why is it so critical to have a written policy? Okay? Why is it so critical? What reasons would you think having a written policy is important? Okay, so we'll look for some answers here. Why do we recommend liability? Yeah, you reduce your tort liability by having a plan if you follow the plan. Okay, so liability is one very important reason. Yep, what else? Boy, liability is driving things. Okay, yep, there's legal reasons, but let's talk about the other non-legal reasons. Give me some non-legal reasons why you might want to have a written policy. It prepares you. It forces you to plan ahead. You're thinking longer term. Somebody in the Q&A put down, it establishes a continuity of operations. Yeah, it's great for communications, both with the board and with the public. If you've got a standard you're holding to, it actually improves your communication. So people know, hey, you live on a road that's the last road plowed, but we're not going to forget about you. Okay? It communicates a standard. It actually allows you to have a higher level of service on some roads versus others. It gives clear expectations and holds, yes, accountability and helps you with training of your crews and, in some respects, training of the public and the board. So we recommend a written policy. Okay. Now, if you need more information on all of this, again, we have that winter maintenance plan. It's in the link in the handout, but this is one I do recommend to go look at. It's a draft to start with to develop your own winter maintenance plan. Okay. Because having a plan is really important. Okay. So let's ask a few questions to finish up our session. And for those who need PDHs, give you your PDH. If you do need a PDH, you just let us know once you get your straight certificate that you need that, and we'll be emailing that to you in a separate later document. Okay. So which is not a factor in determining chemical application rates? The type of precipitation, the route cycle time, the air temperature, or the pavement temperature? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Good. Give you a couple more. Let's see. The answer is air temperature. Yeah, very good. Yeah. Certainly the type of precipitation makes a huge difference. We know that. Route cycle time, you got to add more chemical if you've got a longer cycle time. Air temperature is, yes, we need to monitor it. It can be used as a surrogate, but the best thing to do if you can is to know the pavement temperature. Okay. Stopping distance is shortest on which surface? Soft, loose snow, slushy road with no bonded ice, snowpack, ice, or none of the above. And I'm not talking, dry roads. Did I try to fool you here? Is what I'm really trying to say with E. What would you say? Stopping distance is shortest. Yeah, slushy road with no bonded ice. Yeah. The idea is get rid of the ice or keep the ice from forming is even a better idea if you can. Okay. Yep. B. And then finally, a bare road policy is always recommended on high volume roads. False. Ah, very good. Yeah. We've gotten in the habit of wanting to have bare road policies. We need to do a lot of communication with the public to help them understand we really can't have a bare road policy, but then we need to communicate with them what is the policy. How quickly can we get back to being mostly bare roads? Okay. So we'll go from there. Now, this is the end of today's webinar. We do have 3 more webinars scheduled for the end of the rest of this year on budget basics, traffic safety, and the MUTCD. We do expect the traffic safety and MUTCD ones to be worth the professional development hour. The budget basic ones haven't decided that yet. I'm actually talking with the instructor for that, Tim Hunt from Lewis County, and then we'll decide and let folks know on that particular one. And with that, we are at the top of the hour, according to my clock. You can go and get more information. You can always send me an email. You can just search, or you can look in the handout and get more information. But with that, we're right at the top of the hour. If anybody has any questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A. We'll answer them for you. I did see a note there about somebody who says it didn't register. We'll take care of that. We'll get you worked out since we have your name. And with that, hopefully everybody have yourself a great Thanksgiving holiday. Be safe. Slow down on those snowy roads, and see you in a couple of weeks. Take care. And for those who are saying they're having issues with registration, we'll take care of it. We got your name. We know when you're in and out.